From 15th August 1947 to the present day, every Prime Minister of India, be it Jawaharlal Nehru with his Tryst for Destiny speech, or Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there has been a certain inclination for India's search and recognition amongst the political class as a major power in the world. Whether India had the material balance to push its claims for the seat at the table or not is often discussed. But what we have here today is a new book, The Unfinished Quest India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi by Professor T.V. Paul, which I'm holding up here in front of our screen, which sort of looks into and analyzes the search for major power status, be it via soft power, be it via hard power, a sort of concise book that tells us this is what it is and this is why we've been searching to be recognized globally as a major power. The book Unfinished Quest is is a Westland's book publication and has been launched on the Print softcover, which is our platform for releasing select nonfiction books. I have with me the author, Professor T.V. Paul, a distinguished James McGill professor at McGill University in Canada. Thank you for joining the Print softcover, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Right. As the book title goes, and as again I'm holding it up, it says the unfinished quest, right? And you sort of detail how we've sort of consistently looked at this idea of being considered a major power. Right. My first question to you is what is your sense of why there is this sort of belief in India that we must become a major power. Every politician, every prime minister has had their own way of looking at this. But
Hmm.
I wanted to start off with that. So why do you think for India first wants it, and for India it matters?
It's not unique to India to aspire major power status. If you have most of the attributes, or you know that you will have those attributes in the future, leadership in particular, and increasingly the middle class in India's case, would aspire to have a bigger say in international affairs. And this problem of status acquisition has a long pedigree in the European great power system, where this has been a matter of wars and conflicts and adjustment as a result of unwillingness sometimes to give a code to a new power. So, why India wants to get there? It's story of a civilizational state denied its status, despite the fact that it contributed immensely to human advancement in many ways. And the colonial rule took away quite a bit of that status India had. Before that, of course, other invaders. But I think the colonial rule was part of it, and that then India was denied a Security Council seat in 1945 at San Francisco. And so when the new leadership emerged, they noticed that they have a moral um, uh, reason also to pursue this goal, because they wanted to contribute to the greatness or goodness of humanity. And that was reflected in Nehru's policy on decolonization, pushing for non alignment, the Bandung process, a series of initiatives on nuclear test ban to whatnot, creating new norms, and creating an India with its multiplicity and complexity, a liberal democratic state with some challenges, of course. So, all that was aimed at telling the world we have arrived. Nehru's speech is so powerful, on the midnight of 1940, August 14, midnight. And so the question is this an achievable goal? And it has political implications. In the current regime, for instance, is very much using it for electoral advantages too. But it has values, as literature on status shows, that if you are in the club with some position, you have a lot of advantages, not just satisfaction, psychological satisfaction, but material advancement too, that you determine the fate of others it determines global governance quite a bit. So India's challenge at this point is it is halfway to global governance institutions, some of them newly created, but it is not full way there yet. And it's partly because it's a latecomer in the international order, a post-war order. And secondly, as I argue, its internal development is very asymmetrical, not yet there to show that it is a power to be reckoned with. A 21st century major power, okay? It's not just a 20th century or 19th century European power with coercive power, but a comprehensive power with its own attributes.
Right. No, I understand that. And I see this sense of, holding the fate of others, as you say, right? That this possibility to decide the fate of others. But what I wanted to understand, sort of, and I think your book, and you get a sense of this as you read, is that there are, two focuses: hard power, soft power, and the definitions of this, which you have gone into. But I wanted to get this idea of the markers of hard power and soft power for India, which sort of shows how you say it's halfway there to global governance, but not necessarily full way there. And you've offered us 10 sort of markers, be it both hard and soft power. So I wanted to sort of get this idea from you, sir. Looking at your own markers that you've analyzed, how do you sort of place India's emergence in this new global order?
So the markers are ideal markers. Okay, not every current great power has all those attributes. You need a majority of them, but if you want to be a full-fledged new power with this attractiveness, then you need the soft power elements too. You can have a partial power, as Russia today is, without economic power, but it has established as a great power from, 18th century onwards, or 19th century very much. So it is actually it's fighting to retain that position through the wars that it has been initiated. So here I think the markers are to show that it is among the other peer group powers, or in the rising power peer groups, it is advancing faster than most others. Okay, so but the challenge is India's comparison is with China, unfortunately, which is actually, I know it's unfortunate because China has so many advantages that India doesn't have. And that when China was recognized as a great power by the United States, it was actually a very weak economy. And China used under Deng Xiaoping to expand its market and things like that. So the point is that recognition may come, but the point is diplomatic recognition alone is not enough. So my conclusion, as you will see later, I think you want to discuss that too, is that how to legitimate a new power, and that too a power with a different civilizational attitude, doesn't want to be the coercive European great power, but a power that is valued as a rule maker, rule developer, and a norm developer. A lot of qualities that India may have, and also bringing in its own civilizational attributes, where we have some challenges, as I notice in the book.
Right. So, and here's this question I wanted to ask you, because this is a thought that struck me as I went through it, is that no, you say India, I think in one of the early pages, you say India believes that it needs to be there to be the voice of anti-colonialism, anti-European coerciveness, right? That we believe that it's this moral backing that we need to have to add our voice, which you can say whether it's non-alignment in the 50s or today's voice of the global South. It has evolved as times has evolved, but it's essentially that same principle. Do you see, in practical terms, I think the external affairs minister has multiple times, Mr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, said that in the last 10 years, India has joined or signed 40 major agreements, right? Be it the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, be it the Colombo Security Conclave, which was the most recent charter that was signed, trilaterals, minilaterals. You have all these various terms, so 40 major organizations, give or take. Do you think that is sort of a result of this interest in India to sort of change or move away from this European coercive sense of global power legitimacy, sir?
It's not just India, actually, all rising powers. Look at Brazil, look at South Africa, look at even Indonesia. They value these institutions. Membership in institutions is very critical for recognition, status recognition. And they know that the established institutions, be it the UN Security Council or the World Bank or the IMF, the Western created institutions, are not very inclusive and they are not adapting rapidly. So, whereas these new institutions, creation and joining them is one way to become involved in global governance. And so, it is an era of institution building and institution destruction efforts by the established power, that is the United States. So, Mr. Trump doesn't want to be in any of this, or knows that the newcomers will try to gate crash into them. So, the point is that institutional membership accommodation is one big status marker in modern world. Whether it is the Concert of Europe, where it is the League of Nations, Treaty of Versailles agreements, whether it is the UN Charter. So the new institutions are a way to avoid the older ones. At the same time, there is a desire to be in the established one. That's the UN Security Council. So I think membership is fine, but the challenge for India and the other aspiring powers, they are often they attend these meetings, make resolutions, then they go home. Are they following it up? Are they doing something on key global issues, whether it is war in Ukraine, climate change, or trade issues? Sometimes the institutional performance, institutions' robustness are tested. They are good as ways to engage, to talk, to build consensus. There's a lot of purposes in functional understanding of institutions. But the challenge is these new institutions really have to play a role. And I would put G20 as a critical one here, which I was told that both India and Indonesia played a big role in saving the last two or three meetings, Brazil, the last one, from collapsing because the Western countries wanted to condemn Russia's invasion in the resolution, which would have been a sure no consensus resolution. So this achievement is a sign that India is partly playing a role in creating a world order that is not going to be deeply polarized. So this is another function of institutions to prevent these existing great powers, especially China and the United States, from hijacking the world order into a bipolar order. So India has a stake in avoiding that, along with other rising powers. And so this dual purpose of maintaining one's position as well as preventing a bipolar order is sort of behind this move. And I think it should be member, but it should actively do things more than just sloganeering.
Right. And so that brings me to two questions. But the first part of my question, I think, is this idea of status marker, you say, right? And you just mentioned this idea that to prevent two countries from hijacking the current global order. But in a sense, I just want to understand, India's sort of position vis-a-vis Canada, which is a G7 economy, one of the world's most uh, victorious allies that set up the post-World War order, which we also had 2.5 million soldiers fight World War II, but get no seat at the table. But Canada, a dominion of the British Empire, got a seat at the table, right? So how do you see, historically to today, to the actions taken by the present government in New Delhi with regards to Canada? Right? How do you see this playing out? Do you think it's a status marker for India that look, we're
This is
here?
a history of misperceptions, misunderstanding, largely poor understanding by the Canadians. I have to be honest with you. And they have a post-colonial view of India, which is actually a continuation of the colonial understanding. And then they have a liberal view of the world that if you are not liberal, we are not willing to treat you as an equivalent. So all those things, they won't agree with that, but this is continuation from Mr. Pierre Trudeau, his father, the current leader's father, who also had this idea that, if groups want to secede, they should have a freedom to do what they want. Although they're very funny when it comes to their own friends, and including Israel for today. You can't say things like that, then get away with it. without some retribution. So India has had great difficulty with Canada, and India itself also looks upon or looked upon Canada. Initially, there were friendship to Nehru's period, actually quite a bit of friendship in peacekeeping, etc. But then, as Cold War evolved, India became a side story for Canada, and their main trading partners are the United States and the Western world, G7, as we call it today. And so, but there is a huge population growth in Canada, and in particular, the population segment, that is the Sikh population, have this aspiration, as you know, and they're concentrated in several constituencies. In election time, they have a power, and that they are the most active. But right now, the population is widening. All sorts of people are entering, but they are not organized, so they don't have this kind of aspirations of anything different. They want to keep India united. So Canada's failure to recognize that India values a united India and that it is not negotiable to give a territory or another partition. And this is not registering to their minds and properly. And India has not really impressed upon them properly that you cannot, this is non-negotiable, India's territorial integrity. And that's one. But they will say that, we are not, we are supporting that. We are not just stopping those who want secession. The second was the nuclear issue. Nuclear issue was India used the uranium from Canadian support, and they took it as a very personal reason for a long 40 years of estrangement. Only when the US accommodated, they started thinking about it. So these single issues really hijack this relationship. And but India also looked upon Canada as an appendage of the United States, which is a mistake, I think. It has quite a bit of soft power and institutional power and noise power, as they did at the G20 and later on at different places. So there is a mutual under appreciation. That's my psychological term here, of each other's value. And my own sense is Canada doesn't realize India is a rising power, okay, willing to recognize, unlike, say, Australia, even Britain. So other Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States in particular, Biden never said anything about this subject, as far as I know. So Canada has a long way to go, and unfortunately, the current political dispensation there depends on groups that are Khalistan supporters, and they are pushing hard to break this relationship and succeeding to some extent. So I think we have a long way to go. We need to create a Jaswant Singh Talbot, Stop Talbot sort of a powerful interlocutors engaged conversation. Why we don't appreciate each other? Why? What's the problem? And that can probably melt down some of these problems. But still, Canada's parliamentary system generates conditions for small groups to emerge as powerful players.
Right, sir. I just want to go back and so I understand. We've spoken about status markers, we've spoken about aspirations, but now I want to come down to the real terms, and this is something you have, I think, chapter 7 of your book, which is state capacity. Um, and I think a lot of what you argue, the core argument is that yes, you can be aspirational abroad, but you need to have your domestic economy by itself stand strong. You have to have the material capacity to sort of you know impose your view on the world. And you've spoken about inclusive growth. You've said how the bureaucracy and the elites looked at technical education rather than education of the masses, whereas China went the other way, and this has had a material change. So could you just sort of elucidate on the importance of this?
Yeah, that's one of my core arguments. All rising powers, as far as I know, try to improve their domestic conditions. So go back to Peter the Great, go back to the Bismarck's welfare state in Germany, go to the Meiji Restoration. What are they trying to do? They are trying to become strong, but they're also improving the living conditions of the masses so that they can fight better wars. Okay, that's one of their conditions. See, here, I think India failed in one area, that is not to become a developmental state. As you know, the East Asian economies at growth happened. Simultaneously, they were improving their infrastructural power their societal capacity, intensive education, healthcare, etc. So there are, cases like Korea, which was poorer than India, by the way, when it emerged. Indonesia, partially, and Taiwan, places like that have adopted this idea of developmental state, which requires about, and by the way, in India too, some states have adopted, like Kerala, I would argue, partially. You need to spend about 8 to 9% on education, similar of your GDP, similar number on your healthcare, similar number or more on infrastructure. And so India has consistently spent 2%, now it's 3% on education of GDP. And then you have healthcare, again, less than 2%, I believe. Infrastructure is getting big infrastructure. But look at your cities. I'm in Bangalore. I must say that the city has not changed in the where I'm living. You cannot walk on the footpaths. There's nothing to cross. This is a very developing country city. It shouldn't be. It is India's biggest achievement. These pockets are excellent, but the point is, why don't we create this urban space with the bicycle line, all the things that developmental states have achieved, with parks for children to play, with air better. So that element of development is very skewed in the Indian case. And it has 33 decades of economic growth, at least 6-7% growth. That should be enough to show up on your roads, on your urban planning, on your villages. But we have missed that kind of attitude because there's a lot of focus on the big tech and other things, I guess. But development, it requires inclusive development, especially a society with deep structural problems, that is the caste-based problems, then of course the religious-based issues that are emerging. So you need a social engineering. You need more commitment by the political elite at every level. Okay, this is not the central level alone. The state level, your municipality level, your panchayat level. And this has to enter to their head that the bureaucrats in charge, that my action will determine India's future and India's aspiration to become a major power. I think that hasn't entered yet. So we are in a kind of growth paradigm without the proper development that should be accompanied with it. And there is
Right.
one more reason that
Yes.
this has a material value. If you improve the conditions of that 30% that I'm talking about, they become economically viable actors. The GDP growth rate will be much higher, and you have a better chance to overtake United States at one point, very sooner than later. Yes.
Fair. And this brings me to my last question, and I think I'm going to club two things into this last question. One is you mentioned the sort of the importance of liberal democratic values, right? How the diaspora is trying to make arguments of illiberal fundamentalist views of India in certain pockets, not all, but in certain pockets, and how you know states need to emulate models, and that's something we've seen with China and its BRI. The BRI is fundamentally China's emulation, so people can take the money they need regardless of the domestic politics. Whereas the Western order says, you follow certain conditions, and then we will come and help you, right? So the questions that I want to merge here is, where do you see India on its path to its major power status, and how much will the liberal versus illiberal future and arguments surrounding that you see playing out in Orban's Hungary, or Putin's Russia, and that sort of also cascading to countries around? How much would that sort of be an impediment to actual achievement of being a state, a major power that people look to emulate?
So that actually is a great question. The challenge is every great power or a leading state often comes with an ideology or a model. So the Western great power is often pitched as liberal states. Communist countries, the communism, Marxism as their model. Of course, they usually don't follow all of those. And China has this state development with communism, and I don't know how to describe it, but clearly there is a model, and there's a Tiangxia, that we will help you as long as you don't question our hegemony. So and that's where India's problem is. I mean, the model that we had for the last, the Nehruvian idea was inclusive development and inclusive participation. All that will help India to project this exceptionalism, because not many democracies existed at that time in the so-called post-colonized world. And this large country remained democratic, still has many elements of it. And so, what else can really unite it and show to the world to emulate that our model works, our federalism works, our secularism works, our three language formula worked, a lot of things to integrate a large economy, large country like European Union without really all those borders as the Europeans still have, I think, some of them. And so the point is that this model, of course, it hasn't delivered everything you want. But what other model? I mean, religious nationalists would argue their model will be valuable. But the big challenge is who are going to emulate that model. If you're not born in the particular religion, then it's very hard to just become an emulator of that model. So we are now in an era of populism, and you mentioned some names. My worry is that these are temporary phenomena. These leaders you mentioned, they fail. They cannot bring, including Mr. Trump, permanent prosperity change. They will bring some. I mean, stock market may show some improvement short period, but long term the problems persist, because it will percolate into your domestic society, the conflicts that it generates. And over time, in the United States, look at it. I mean, there's so much conflict as a result of this populist movement. So, what do we need then? A better democracy, quality democracy, welfare oriented democracy, inclusiveness, and human desire for freedom is fundamental. And so, India cannot just say that we don't care about any of that. We need status and we want to be a seat on the table, but it will have serious consequences for internal cohesion, internal integration, and the well-being of humanity. So India, as I mean, Nehru and all had a vision of, although sometimes very problematic, that India should be a beacon of, just like the Americans call themselves as, the light on the hill or whatever, of something coming out of a civilizational values, all that. But all that can be only if it includes others who are not in the mainstream or the majority religion or groups that aspire to have that role.
Right, and that was my last question, sir. And thank you so much for joining us here at the Print soft cover. But once again, I must say, the unfinished quest, India's search for major power from Nehru to Modi, by Professor T.V. Paul. It's published by Westland Books. It's out now. It's a wonderful book, great insights, and thank you so much for joining us here today, Professor Paul.
Thank you for having me, and I enjoyed the conversation.